Relish in the fact of all being in this room together. I'm Davey Niddle. I'm Assistant Professor of English at the University of Delaware. I am a Penn English PhD alum and a person whose life was massively improved by all the folks in GSWS, and it's nice to extend that gratitude in this space. Our speakers, two of whom are here, and one of whom is on Zoom, will join us in this session. Same structure as the previous session, so one presentation, Perry Zurn will start. I'll introduce Perry in a second. Second presentation from Che Gossett, who's joining us on Zoom, and then third presentation from Francisco J. Golarte, who is right here. And then we'll have some time for conversation among the panelists, and then some time for conversation with all of you. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much to the panelists for being here. So first is Perry Zurn. Perry Zurn is Associate Professor of Philosophy at American University and Affiliate Faculty in the Department of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies. Zurn will be a Fellow at the Society for the Humanities at Cornell University, 23-24, and a Visiting Scholar at the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, 23-25. Lucky Penn. Awesome. He researches primarily in political philosophy, critical theory, and transgender studies, and collaborates in psychology and network neuroscience. He's the author of Curiosity and Power, The Politics of Inquiry, 2021, and the co-author of Curious Minds, The Power of Connection, MIT Press, 2022. He is also the co-editor of Active Intolerance, Michel Foucault and the Prison's Information Group and the Future of Abolition, 2016, Carceral Notebooks 12, 2017, Curiosity Studies, A New Ecology of Knowledge, 2020, and Intolerable, Writings from Michel Foucault and the Prison's Information Group, 1970 to 1980, 2021. He's currently at work on a new monograph, How We Make Each Other, Trans-Poetics at the Edge of the University, under contract Duke University Press, and co-editing Trans Philosophy, Meaning and Mattering, which is under review. Please join me in welcoming Perry Zurn.
Thanks so much for having me and for being here and for sharing in these conversations. I've already learned a lot and I'm excited about learning more. Today I want to head my remarks as the poetics of trans pedagogy. And we'll say a little bit more about what I mean by poetics or want to mean by poetics moving forward here. First, I want to not start with poetics, I want to start with policies. And I want to start by kind of pointing out what I see as mainstreamed trans-inclusive policies and then sideline trans-inclusive policies, because I think this framing helps us think about the elements of trans pedagogies that get mainstreamed and the elements of trans pedagogy that get sidelined. So in a broader trans-inclusive policy framework in the universities across the US, there are really 5 big policy changes that typically happen for trans inclusion. Number 1, adding a non-discrimination clause to the university and or city in which the university is, adding specifically gender identity and gender expression. Second, pronouns and name change policies. These are really common ways of changing universities for trans inclusion. Improving inclusive bathrooms and housing for students and sometimes faculty. And then adding trans healthcare coverage as well, both mental health care coverage as well as surgeries and hormones if desired. And then lastly, trans programming to raise awareness across campus. So these are really the big 5, and a lot of people are still struggling with the big 5. But some people are doing fairly well. And then the things that are really sidelined tend to be things around curriculum, so trans scholarship methods and pedagogies, around collections, trans library holdings and archives, around personnel, actually recruiting trans students, staff, and faculty, around research, supporting trans-led research, and then around community, engaging local trans communities. And the reason, one of the things I like to point out when I have this list is to say, the things that are mainstreamed practices are things that Chase Bank and Starbucks are also working on. And that means that the things that are mainstreamed here are not specific to the university, are not addressing the heart of what the university does, which is our curriculum, our research, our collections, our personnel, all of those things. So I want to preface this and then turn to questions of pedagogy, and in this case, I tried to get the most stereotypical flyer version of a university classroom I could find from my university website. So that is the context of this particular, if this particular photo. We can talk about that later, but especially at a PWI. But in a college classroom, what are the things that are central, right? So I think that a lot of times we may change our pedagogies, and this is more especially for cis or ally folks in the room. We might think about trans inclusion thinking about, by saying, you know, well, how do I talk, again, share pronouns and names, or how do I construct my syllabus, or do I tell people where the closest inclusive bathroom is? All good things, one should do those things, but those are really, in a sense, peripheral to what you do as a professor in a classroom setting. And so I want to talk about something far more central to what each of us is doing, and that is our trans methods. So I want to talk about our methods in our disciplines, which has already come up to some degree, and our methods in the classroom, and what does it mean to trans those methods or to use trans methods in a classroom. There's a lot that has been done to try to develop trans-inclusive methods in different disciplines, and we've already heard that there's also a lot of limitations to that. That is still like a question. What is a trans method in each of our fields looks like? What does transing the existing methods look like? So there's a lot of work left to be done. One of the things I'm going to do here is simply pivot to say there's one way to answer the question of trans methods and what it might look like in the classroom and in pedagogy, and that is to look at trans studies appeals to trans grammars or to trans punctuation marks as symbols of what these methods could be. So this is just one way to start tackling this kind of question. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to say what grammars and punctuation marks has trans studies in the US appealed to as markers of its methods, and what might that mean for trans pedagogy in the classroom. And as I trace those appeals, one of the things I want to do is also point out a critique of those appeals, because a lot of times trans studies appeals to these punctuation marks and grammars is subtended by a particular ableism. All of this will make sense. So first, ellipsis. The ellipsis has become a mark of the trans work of undoing or of poking a hole in cis heteronormativity. So think about how you might teach your field or engage in your classroom through elliptical pedagogies, okay? The ellipsis comes from a word that means to put a leave in, Reflecting on the poetry of Carrie Edwards, Trace Peterson muses on the ellipsis as an answer to the problem of identity writing. And Regina Consul cites Kaji Amin as thinking the ellipsis is a tool by which to press open the soldering of discourse. So the ellipsis here among trans scholars has been used as this kind of rupture of identity writing and a rupture of the soldering of discourse. How might one do that in your own fields? The ellipsis is also, though, there's more to it. It's a marker of informal or undisciplined or ungovernable speech, the ... 1950s grammarian Eric Partridge says it intimates that there's a pause in action, a hiatus in the thinking, a hesitation in the dialogue that signals the informality of speech. What would it mean to signal in our work, in our coursework, the informalities that are true of our fields, that are true of the people about which we are speaking? But ellipsis is also related to the ellipse, the mathematical ellipse, and elliptical movement. So Jacques Derrida has a nice piece in which he talks about this relationship, and he says, in both cases, you see a circle that refuses closure, both in the ellipsis and in the ellipse. A circle that refuses closure, a missing of the mark, a misfitting of the mark, shortfalls and falling short, and for that reason, a way of inching around. Here is a trans, and I would argue also crip grammar, this failure, this missing of the mark, this circle that refuses to close. Second case study here, hyphen. Obviously long used in discussions of racialized and migrant identities in the US context, the hyphen has also been appealed to quite widely in trans studies, again, as established in the United States, Susan Stryker, Paisley Cura, and Lisa Jean Moore, in their 2008 field-defining special issue of Women's Studies Quarterly, say they want to turn from the nominalism of simply trans to the relationality of trans hyphen. So it allows them to talk about, sure, trans hyphen gender, but also transnational, transdisciplinary, translation, trans whatever. And they think that that is one of the promises of trans studies. But there are richer and also more troubling resources, I think, in hyphen's history. So in ancient Greek, one of the things that is true of writing in ancient Greek early on was that there wasn't a separation between words. So if you had transgender lives, this would all be one string of letters. And the hyphen came in as a way of separating the words, but not simply separating, but establishing an unstable relationship between the words. Say these two words belong and are separate, right? Belong and are separate. Few centuries later, with the Gutenberg Bible, which you see an example of here, one of the things, Gutenberg, right, was obsessed with these justified lines, these perfectly justified lines. But in order to do those, you can't actually maintain justification. You have to set to the side these marginal hyphens that say, actually, I've just cut this word in half, please see next line, right? In doing so, the hyphen holds meaning, anchors meaning in the very margins of the text. Again, think metaphorically about your fields. Where are those marginal hyphens, those things that hold meaning outside of the justified lines of the discourse that you typically teach and know? And then today, of course, hyphens are often, or perhaps most often, used as for breaks in sense. Whenever in literature there's a sob or a stammer or a gasp, you'll often see a hyphen. Sob, stammer, gasp. Breaks in sense. What kind of trans/crypt grammar might be here in the hyphen, and how might it challenge how we teach what we teach and how we construct the discourses in our classrooms or our learning environments? Last example, the asterisk. How can I not, right? One must speak of the asterisk. And the asterisk is sort of like the fancy younger sibling of the hyphen. If you think about hyphens, one way to think about it is as the asterisk is three hyphens sort of in a wheel together, right? We just want to magnify our hyphenatedness in a sense. Obviously, the appeal in trans studies to the asterisk has ridden on the coattails of the computer search function, where if you add an asterisk after a term, it'll give you the term plus any other thing it's been related to or smushed next to. And that has been an inspiration for the appeal in trans studies. And that appeal has been really formalized in the case of TSQ, which does include, doing this research, I was like, it does? Yes, it does. It includes an asterisk. That is part of its construction, necessary construction of the title. T*SQ in 2014. And Stryker and Cura at the time said they wanted to do that to signal the inherently unfinishable combinatory work of trans. Inherently unfinishable combinatory work of trans. And then in 2018, Duke University Press announced the launch of the Asterisk series, which is a series in trans theory, and they described the goal of that particular series as to capture whatever comes after trans. There's a lot forward-looking. What's next? What is it connected to? Let's go. But again, I think there's an important. I want to say that trans studies has given the asterisk a star-like quality. In that it becomes fast-paced and gregarious and well-connected, but I do want to pose a crypt challenge to that use of the asterisk. So, and to that, again, I turn back to history. So the Gregorian chant and psalmody, for example, uses an asterisk to signal a long pause, a pause longer than other pauses. Where notes scramble up and down the staff, clamoring like euphoric climbers and sliders, the asterisk stops things in their tracks long enough to cause discomfort. What might it mean to think trans asterisk as a long pause, or precisely a suspension of movement rather than a proliferation of movement? A slowness, a stumbling along, going neither fast nor far, a halting or a haltedness. Another thing about the asterisk history, or actually the biology of the asterisk. In order to say the word asterisk, which is remarkably difficult, I'm realizing as I say it to you now, you have to use a glottal stop. You have to close your speaking orifice. there has to actually be a moment of silence. What would it mean to think trans asterisk not as a word glut in the way that it has been appealed to in trans studies, but as silence? What would it mean to think the asterisk, as Saidiya Hartman does, with the unsaid and the unsayable, the archival absences, and perhaps with blackness itself for her? What would it mean to think trans asterisk not as the many things that can be said, but as those that can't, or at least slow speech, perhaps slurred speech? Last pause here for the asterisks. Grammatically, of course, the asterisk can signal an abrupt or considerable transition. We may all use this, right? When we get to the conclusion that we have no name for, we put some asterisks up there first. It's a break, a refusal to link, a rejection of connection. What would it mean to think trans asterisk not as summoning the many things that can be linked, but the many things that can't be linked? What if the asterisk marked the broken links, the chasms of incommensurability, what doesn't connect about gender or anything else for that matter? What if trans asterisk were precisely the energy to break off, break away, find a break, take a break, or embrace a breakdown? So I'm offering these three, again, as trans grammars, but also with the crip critiques, or possible trans crip grammars, and asking, again, what would it mean to teach? What does it mean to teach in a way that emphasizes all of these relations, but also their breakages in our own fields? There are, of course, more signs that one could appeal to. I think the X in particular would be especially helpful and interesting, and I know Francisco Galarte has written about this in the room as well. So the X obviously can mean the undefined and undefinable of trans, specifically, or in the case of its addition to Latinx, but it can also mean wrong answer, right? False, X'd out. Similarly, the slash for Unzaldua is a cut, right? And it can certainly be a cut in the flesh, but for her it can also be a cut in the mind that opens a portal to other ways of imagining and seeing the world, non-normative ways of imagining and seeing the world. And that cut could be related with Mika Cardenas' work or Ava Hayward's work, and thinking of trans scars, and there's all kinds of things that we could do there. Or maybe even Marquis Bey has written about what it means to be a question mark for trans. So I think there's a lot of these appeals, interestingly, to punctuation marks and to grammatical marks. And I think that they offer ways forward for trans methodologies, but I do want to pose crip pauses to them. In summarizing where it is that I want to go here. Poetics of trans pedagogy from this lens, right, which is a very limited one, but an interesting one. Trans pedagogy is not just what we do, but how we do it. And I know that for a lot of us folks in the room, we already know that, but I think it warrants returning to. It's not just what we do in the classroom, it's how we do it. We have to think about our methods in the classroom, but also our methods in the field and what we're doing with them or not doing with them. Trans pedagogy is also not just the sense we build, but how we break it. So the ellipsis, there's an escaping of discourse in a way that is ungovernable. How does one do that in a classroom? How does one facilitate that in the classroom? How does the hyphen, breaking units into uneasy relationships as much as putting them into relation. Don't just say, oh, and this applies to trans folks. Here's a trans issue that kind of relates to what we're talking about, right? That's a easy relation hyphen. What about breaking it, right? This is a way in which a trans issue doesn't actually relate to this, actually breaks open whatever it is we're talking about, and we don't know what the next step is in thinking. Or asterisks, putting a pause in, tangling as much as attaching. Coming to this place where we have to stop talking in a classroom. Trans pedagogy then can't be just additive or accumulative in its approach, and I think it is primarily spoken of in that way, but has to be a habit of disruption and loss. And I want to propose that trans pedagogy may need to be non-trivially trans-mad in the sense that Kavar uses, and I'll say a little bit about that. I don't just mean to connect trans pedagogies with disability pedagogies or access pedagogies, although I think that's important. From what we know, 39% of trans folks report as studied, report having a disability or an impairment of some kind. That means that when we're talking about trans pedagogies, we better be talking about disability pedagogies, right? And folks like Alexander Burrill, J. Logan Smilges, and Cameron Awkward-Rich have done much to help us think about neurotrans, neuroqueer, queer crip, and trans maladjustment. But I don't just mean to be proposing that or to be highlighting that here. I do want to talk about how our epistemologies in the classroom, how we construct and understand knowledge together. Kavar defines trans madness as, and I quote, a wandering and wondering praxis, anticipating and refusing neurotypical, sane, cis supervision in both the structure of our thoughts and the comportment of our bodies. Both the structure of our thoughts and the comportment of our bodies. It is a trying to cultivate mad sense or breaks in sense and sanity in our citation practices, our epistemologies, our discourses, our writing, our conversations, our assessment rubrics, our skill goals in the classroom, etc., 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 etc. This means that we have to move beyond thinking about, for example, pedagogies of access and pedagogies of care, which I think trans folks and trans studies folks who've been working in pedagogy do a good job of trying to build, some of those resonances out. But we need to also be talking about a pedagogy of the mad, the maladjusted, the unruly, the glitch, the pastiche, the disorderly, the blur, and the borderline. What is a pedagogy of the blur? I want to close with a quick story. In my first job as a professor, a visiting professor at Hampshire College in spring 2016, there were TERF lyrics that were passed out in the cafeteria one morning. And it really ruptured the campus, which is a relatively queer, trans, idyllic place, despite all of its other problems, right? That's true. Trans folks, including myself, gathered the next day for pizza and soda to read poetry by trans poets and to then flyer the poems around campus. One of the poems we read was Lilith Latini's Gloria Talks Back to Patti Smith, an earlier version than the one that was published in 2013. And I have just two sections from that, or two stanzas from that poem. The pine barrens only grow by setting fire to their body. Each pine cone's tiered shell already embodies flame, ready to reach and open up reflection. Red needles over the sandy soil, I told myself this story at the precipice of choosing, glory burnt across my heart. I think in the task of trans inclusion or trans affirmation in universities and specifically in pedagogies, sometimes we can be so busy planting pine forests, we forget to learn the wisdom of the pine cone, its undoing and its fire. What is the grammar, perhaps the trans-mad grammar of a pine cone? What is the pedagogy of a pine cone? Generation and destruction, from singularity to scatter, breaking open, breaking up, and breaking down. How are we thinking this break and this fire in the classroom, not just about the classroom? Thanks.